In today's lecture, we're going to be talking about substance-related disorders. So the Psychological Association kind of moved away from the term addiction a while ago simply because of the stigma associated with that word and the negative connotation associated with that word. And so they developed terms like substance use disorder or substance abuse disorders. And so in this particular lecture, we're going to be talking generally about features related to what is traditionally known as addiction, but we're going to refer to, or the correct term for addiction now is substance abuse. So we're going to talk about substance-related disorders. But before we discuss any details about it, most importantly, here's your dad joke of the day. Who won the neck decorating contest? It was a tie. Ba-dum-tsh. So addiction is complicated. You can think of it as a paradox simply because it's clear that the behaviors that the person is engaging in who has a substance abuse disorder is harming them in many, many ways, and yet they are unable to stop. So typically, when a person experiences negative consequences of a behavior they've engaged in, that negative consequence deters them from continuing to engage in those behaviors, right? You get punished for something, you stop engaging those behaviors, or at least you get better at hiding it. But with addiction, it almost seems like despite the fact that there are these harmful, damaging, life-changing consequences to their behaviors, they continue to maintain their addiction. And so that's a paradox of addiction. The word paradox is a term referring to when two things are both true but don't seem to make sense together. So in this instance, the person is maintaining negative behaviors that have negative consequences, and you would think that they would stop those behaviors, but they still continue engaging in those behaviors. So it doesn't make sense. Unfortunately, despite the fact that scientists have attempted to come up with various hypotheses and theories to explain addictive behaviors or substance abuse disorder behavior, there is no complete explanation of that paradox. What's interesting, and so some of this data that I'm going to share with you is about 10 years old, so it's a bit outdated, but it's the most recent data that I have to share with you. So keep that in mind as you're kind of thinking about the data that I'm going to share. But it's clear that drugs are being widely consumed. Even 10 years ago, before the legalization of marijuana in many states across the United States, people were using illicit drugs. So 10% of the US population at the time was using illicit drugs, and this was marijuana was included in the illicit drugs because at the time marijuana was not legal in as many states as it is now. After marijuana, though, the second highest category of abused illegal drugs are prescription painkillers such as oxycodone or fentanyl, which we'll talk about in another lecture. We aren't even considering the fact that drugs that are legal, such as tobacco and alcohol, are even more widely consumed. So just to give you an idea of the percentages of drug use from that 2016 survey, 10.6% of people were using illicit drugs at the time, which included marijuana. That equated to about 28.6 million had used an illicit drug within the past month that they administered the survey. The highest percentage was marijuana, 24 million people had used marijuana, and then you can see the next highest, which is a stark difference between marijuana and the others, was prescription painkillers and tranquilizers. So it seems like substances are being used, even if they are illegal. What was also interesting is that the age group that most utilized these substances or illegal drugs were between the ages of 18 to 25. And when we talk in this lecture about addiction as a developmental disorder, you'll see how adolescence is kind of at a ripe stage to develop addictions. So it's not surprising that the highest percentage of individuals who used illegal drugs were between the age group of 18 and 25. So addiction is complex, and it's really difficult to come up with a precise definition to kind of define addiction, because it can include physical dependence. So physical dependence refers to when you've been using the drug for a while and you stop using the drug, it's going to lead to withdrawal symptoms. So the absence of using the drugs results in unpleasant withdrawal symptoms, and oftentimes this physical dependence and experiencing the withdrawal symptoms motivates the person to return to using the drug again, to just stop those withdrawal symptoms because they're so unpleasant. But not all drugs cause physical dependence. For example, cocaine is a highly addictive drug and does not produce any physical dependence. That does not mean it is not addictive or people can't develop addiction to it, right? So as I just mentioned, another feature of drug abuse and addiction is behavior. So sometimes addiction is influenced by the fact that the person's attempting to avoid withdrawal symptoms, but more often than not, the person who is addicted is driven by what's called a craving, this kind of strong urge to take the drug. So I don't know if you've ever felt like a really uncomfortable itch that you kind of feel like you have to scratch and you can't ignore it. That may or may not come close to a craving that an addicted person may experience. The other feature of addiction is that people remain addicted for long periods of time, even following detox or like the clearance of the drug from their system. They can still experience intense bouts of cravings and return back to the drug. It's called falling off the wagon, right? So a person may end up experiencing a relapse. So oftentimes drug-free periods, which are known as remissions, are typically followed by relapses where the person goes back to using the drug, even though they've experienced negative consequences for it. So strong is this desire for the drug that they typically use, they end up relapsing despite the fact that they know that there might be negative consequences with their return to the substance. Before we kind of dive into nitty-gritty details associated with addiction, I want to introduce you to a couple of terms that you may or may not be familiar with. The first one is tolerance. So you may have heard of tolerance as somebody needing more of a substance to produce the same effect. That is absolutely correct. But it is also known as the decreased sensitivity to a given dosage of a drug because the person has been using it chronically. So over time, what ends up happening is the body does not necessarily like the presence of the drug, and so it likes to maintain homeostasis, and the presence of the drug kind of pulls it out of homeostasis. So what the body does is it puts into place biochemical changes at the cellular level to counteract the effect of the drug. And so when it makes these changes, the initial drug dose is no longer effective because the counteractive measures the body puts into place kind of negates the effects of the drug, which is why a person needs to take a higher dose of the drug to override those changes and experience drug effects. Unfortunately, with chronic use, right, we develop tolerance to the drug, And so when the drug is no longer on board, those biochemical changes that the body put into place at the cellular level produces withdrawal symptoms. So withdrawal symptoms, as we've talked about, occur when a person stops taking the drug. Oftentimes, these withdrawal symptoms are the opposite effects of the drug, and that makes sense because when the body is attempting to oppose the effects of the drug, it's going to put into effect changes that are going to cancel out the drug. So it's going to put changes that oppose the drug. And so when the drug is not present in the body, these changes reveal themselves and show up as withdrawal symptoms. For example, alcohol, you can develop withdrawal symptoms from alcohol because people develop tolerance to it. So alcohol is a sedative. It kind of shuts down the excitation of the nervous system. And the body doesn't like that. So what it does is, to counteract the effects of alcohol, it puts into place changes that excite or enhance the activity of the nervous system. And so when a person stops drinking or the alcohol clears from their system, again, this is with chronic use, you end up seeing a hyper-excitable nervous system. So the withdrawal symptoms of alcohol represent a hyperactive state or hyper-excitable state to counteract the sedative inhibitory effects that the drug produces. So the tolerance and withdrawal are actually related. They're two kind of sides of the same coin. So the progression of drug use varies. It is thought, or it was believed, that certain drugs, can lead to the use of even harsher drugs. So the gateway theory of drug use argues that using any drug, maybe what's seen as less harmful drugs, can lead to the use of harder, quote unquote, harder substances. So it's thought that if a person begins using marijuana, they might eventually progress to using things like heroin, right? So we're essentially opening the gates for drug use by using a less harmful drug and then progressing into more harmful drugs. There's some support to suggest this might be the case. So what I've shown you here is a chart of drug users in 12th grade who've used both drugs in the category drug A and drugs in category drug B. So what you have here is a list of drugs that they started first or a list of drugs that they started second. In some instances, you'll notice that they started with a legal drug and then progressed to a more illegal and more addictive drug. Similarly, again, cigarettes to crack or cigarettes to cocaine. And then what you're looking at here are the percentage of these 12th graders that tried drug A before they started using drug B. And you'll notice that these percentages are much higher than the opposite, which is starting drug B before drug A. These percentages are much lower. And here's the percentage of kids that started both A and B around the same age. So you'll notice that drug A, many of them were legal, alcohol and cigarettes and marijuana. They aren't considered as hard drugs, so to speak, and are consumed socially, whereas some of the drugs in drug B category, alcohol may be considered less worse than marijuana. I'll show you data that's actually the opposite is true. But crack cocaine, and any cocaine for that matter, is by far the most addictive of any of these substances listed here, and they're largely found in the B column. And most of the 12th graders used drug A before they attempted drug B. So this just goes to show that there might be something to this gateway theory of drug use. You utilize one drug and therefore you're more likely to utilize another more harsher drug. So another feature of the drug use is to look at changes in the amount or pattern or consequences of drug use. And when we think about that, there's a prevailing perception in research of addiction that drug use often occurs on a continuum. It is not linear in any way. It's not like you get started on one path and then progress to the next. It's not like a stepwise progression. It in fact appears to be cyclical and circular. So it is now viewed as a continuum of drug use, and this kind of figure illustrates that continuum of drug use. Abstinence is initially triggered by initial experimentation, which often occurs during the adolescent period. That initial experimentation might go to absolutely no further use, and that person may never use a substance or that substance again. However, it's possible that after initial experimentation, the person may enter this kind of cyclical pattern of drug use where they end up utilizing the drug in a non-problematic way, but then they might eventually progress to substance abuse, where they're using it quite regularly and chronically, leading to dependence. But that dependence may make them realize, oh, I really need to stop, and so they might abstain. But they might go back to non-problematic use, or they might revert back to substance dependence with regular use. So it is a cyclical process. Once you enter this path, or I should say this continuum, there might be some people that abstain and never use it again once they get clean, but more often than not, people tend to kind of fall off the bandwagon and begin using it again, or not bandwagon, fall off the wagon, excuse me, and begin using it again, believing that they have control over their drug use, and then it traverses or develops into more regular use, and the pattern continues. But there is no path or linear progression of drug use, which is why it is viewed as a continuum of drug use. When we take a look at the patterns of kind of drug use as these, features of the continuum change, what you're looking at here are long-term addicts who utilized opiates. So these are things like morphine, heroin, fentanyl. Those are opiates. And so these are individual subjects that were evaluated for their pattern of drug use, and they were followed from anywhere to up to 20 years. If they survive that long, you'll notice that these long-term opiate addicts experience numerous changes in their drug use patterns. If we were to compare, let's not compare 149, let's compare 145 with 90, you'll notice that these two have really different patterns of use, right? They were both incarcerated at different periods. This person was incarcerated for much longer, and so they didn't stop using it. Then they went from daily use to occasional use, whereas here we've got pretty occasional use. They abstained, they went back to occasional use, then daily use, then they were institutionalized, so on and so forth. So you'll see that the pattern of drug use, at least with regard to opiate users, even though they share the same drug, same class of drug, opiates, their pattern of use is not the same. The other thing to look at is kind of what the government considers addictive. So what you're looking at here is the schedule of controlled substances. So controlled substances are substances that are kind of illegal to purchase outside of a prescription or through the medical field. So, you can't grow these things, for example. And then they're listed in kind of different schedules or categories. Schedule 1 is supposedly the worst. Schedule 5 is the least worst category of these controlled substances. And here you have a description of what kinds of drugs fall into each of these categories. In Schedule 1, these substances have high abuse potential and they have no medical use. Over here, you might have some abuse potential, but less than those seen in Schedule 4. And there are examples of substances from these schedules listed all the way in the column to the right. You'll notice that marijuana is listed as a Schedule 1 drug. There is a clear evidence for medicinal use for marijuana or THC, and LSD, for example, is starting to be researched for treatments such as PTSD. So I should mention that this schedule of controlled substances was developed in 1972. And that's before I was born, which is insane. But it's still used to this day to determine who goes to jail and who doesn't. So if you find somebody who has a large amount of marijuana, they're going to get a stiffer sentence than somebody who gets caught with barbiturates, for example. And so this is the problem with the fact that we are utilizing a kind of law to govern or punish drug use that is so outdated and is not in line with what research has clearly shown. And research that is not much older than when the schedule of controlled substances was put into effect. So what I'm going to show you is research from the mid-1990s, so about 20 years after the schedule of controlled substances was put into place. You have two sets of ratings from scientists well known in the field for studying and researching addiction. And what they've done is there are different features of addiction, and they have rated each drug from 1 to 6 on those various characteristics. So I'm going to kind of orient you to this table. So Henningfield is one of the scientists, Benowitz is the other scientist. These are the categories that they have rated the different drugs listed here. And you'll notice, so I've highlighted nicotine, which is legal, caffeine, which is legal, and marijuana at the time was completely illegal in many, many states. And you can see that's the case for both for Benowitz and Henningfield. So the drugs that get a rating of 1 are the most severe for that particular category. So the way to read this is that alcohol is the worst drug in this list for withdrawal, and marijuana is the least worst for the withdrawal effects. So in some ways you can view it as alcohol as being more addictive compared to marijuana. So numbers that are higher represent lesser addiction. Numbers that are lower represent higher addiction. And again, you'll notice alcohol, nicotine, these guys have much lower numbers compared to caffeine and marijuana. And yet at the time, right, 1990s, that was, 30 years ago, it was still illegal. Marijuana was still considered to be way more dangerous compared to nicotine and alcohol, which continue to be legal today. So despite the fact that nicotine and alcohol appear to be way more addictive in their properties, as rated by 2 addiction experts, those 2 substances remain legal, whereas substances like marijuana are illegal even to this day in some states across the country. Addiction is viewed by most research as a developmental disorder. The reason why is that during the adolescent period, adolescents tend to engage in risk-taking behavior. That is the feature of the adolescent period. And so it is often during this time that experimentation with substances starts. It's like, oh, that looks like fun. I'm going to do it because my parents have told me not to. Unfortunately, these substances that the adolescent uses may affect the brain of the adolescent way differently compared to the adult. So in a study done in 2003, they found that when they administered nicotine to adolescent rodents, again, we can't do that to humans, so it was in an animal model, when nicotine was administered to adolescent rodents, it took less nicotine to produce addiction compared to when they tested the same drug in adults. So it turns out that adolescents need less of the drug to become addicted and are more likely to become addicted to the substances. And so therefore, adolescence is when addictions develop, and that's why addiction is seen as a developmental disorder. So a couple of terms from your textbook. Substance dependence, which is also addiction, or substance abuse, which is also the same thing as addiction, is the inability to kind of stop a self-destructive habit. What's happening is that addictive substances stimulates a neurotransmitter in the brain within a system that exists for natural rewards. The neurotransmitter in question is dopamine. So dopamine is utilized in many different parts of the brain, but it's also utilized in the natural reward system where it gets released to allow us to experience pleasure from whatever the behavior we're engaging in. The reward system exists in the midbrain. So many drugs act on different neurotransmitter systems. So NT, that I've abbreviated here, stands for neurotransmitter systems in the brain. But when we talk about addiction, all drugs that are addictive, quote unquote, seem to stimulate dopamine release from this reward system. So dopamine, specifically in the reward system, is reinforcing. If you're unfamiliar with that term or don't remember it, reinforcing is when the outcome of a particular behavior ensures that the behavior occurs again. So in this context, whatever causes dopamine release, whatever behavior or drug causes dopamine release, causes the person to engage in those behaviors or use that drug again. So dopamine gets released following drug use, and that is reinforcing, where the person will say, oh, that felt really good, and they will want to use that substance again. So as I mentioned, the brain has a natural reward mechanism that's supposed to, or exists, not because someday it's hoping that we will use a substance, but it's there more to help drive motivated behaviors. It allows us to experience pleasure from natural reinforcers, things that keep us alive, like sex, hunger, sleep, thirst, right? So we can derive pleasure from natural reinforcers, and that's why the system exists. Unfortunately, drugs of abuse tend to produce such intense dopamine release from the system that it does not compare to the amount of dopamine that gets released by natural reinforcers, which is why oftentimes people who are addicted to substances have a hard time drawing pleasure from things that they used to before, because nothing can compare to the dopamine hit or pleasure from utilizing their substance. So here's that natural reward pathway that I was referring to. It involves 3 brain regions. So it's the communication between these brain regions that ensures kind of a stamp of addiction on that for that particular drug. So it involves the ventral tegmental area, or VTA, the nucleus accumbens, and the prefrontal cortex. So the cell bodies or neurons live in the ventral tegmental area and make dopamine. So the VTA neurons make dopamine. They live in the midbrain. Their axons go to the nucleus accumbens and the prefrontal cortex where the dopamine is released. Okay, so the way we would say this is that the ventral tegmental area releases dopamine onto the nucleus accumbens and the prefrontal cortex. Dopamine in this pathway doesn't just get released willy-nilly, it only gets released when we experience something that is pleasurable, or when we use a drug of abuse. What makes the drug addictive is the release of dopamine in this pathway. Okay? So when dopamine from the VTA gets released on the nucleus accumbens, that particular release triggers what we experience as pleasure. On the other hand, the dopamine from the ventral tegmental area getting released into the prefrontal cortex serves as a predictor of the reward. What that means is that when dopamine gets released into the prefrontal cortex, you form essentially a memory for that reward, and you can better predict the circumstances that you're going to experience that reward in the future. So I'll give you an example that you might be able to relate to. So if you went on a vacation the first time with your family, or you played a video game that you really, really enjoyed, that first time the ventral tegmental area released dopamine onto the nucleus accumbens, which allowed you to experience the pleasure from those two events. But it also released dopamine into the prefrontal cortex, which said, "Ooh, I gotta remember this. This felt really good." The next time, simply in anticipation of, plans to play with your video game or plans to go on vacation to the destination you had fun on before, is going to cause release of dopamine into the prefrontal cortex, allowing you to predict the reward, right? So you derive pleasure at that point, not just from the reward itself, but in anticipation of the reward. And to kind of illustrate this, so you're looking at PET scans, positron emission tomography scans, in a living person who is addicted to crack cocaine. They're not, they haven't used crack cocaine recently, but while they were in the PET scan, they were shown videos of crack cocaine being prepared. So simply watching the preparation of their substance of use caused activation of the ventral tegmental area, the nucleus accumbens, and the prefrontal cortex. Those three regions that are part of the reward pathway. So anywhere that's like red, yellow indicates intense activation. So this is illustrating the fact that addiction changes the brain in fundamental ways where the drug itself alone does not need to be present in order for the person to experience pleasure. They're going to experience pleasure in anticipation of the drug, right? Which essentially is craving. So this pathway is activated not because they use the drug, but in anticipation of the future use of the drug, likely leading to the experiences that we might call craving. So the thing about substance use or addiction is that it's a misnomer, simply because you can have people becoming dependent on things like gambling, video game playing, and other activities. So it's not simply just substances that people can become dependent on. There are behaviors. So anything that causes dopamine release in the in the reward pathway has the potential for becoming addictive, right? So all of these activities cause dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens in the reward pathway. And so you have to ask yourself, how do you determine what is or is not addictive? People don't simply have to become addicted to substances. So what motivates behaviors like addiction, where people, despite the negative consequences, continue to go back to using their substance of abuse? The first is tolerance, right? People end up experiencing these biological changes in their body as a result of the drug being present, and so they need higher doses of the drug to produce the same effects they experienced the first time they used the substance. And so one of the reasons that people may go back to continuing using their drug despite the negative consequences is they want to stop the withdrawal symptoms they may feel as a result of stopping the drug use, right? So they might end up going back to using the substance even though they intend to kind of become abstinent. The withdrawal symptoms are so severe that it often leads them back to using the drugs to make the withdrawal symptoms go away. Another reason people may go back to using substances despite the negative consequences is that they might not have great coping mechanisms, and so they might be using the substance to cope with distress. And so we often see situations where somebody who used to be addicted to a substance and was no longer addicted to it go back to it following a period of a stressful event in their life, right? So if they lose their jobs or if there's a death in the family, they might cope with that distress by using a substance instead of following other coping strategies. Now, in research in the scientific field, any scientific field, including neuroscience, as well as the medical field, addiction is seen as a disease, right? I've shown you that following chronic use of substances, including crack cocaine, which I showed you, changes the brain in many, many ways, to the point where these changes often can take months, if not years, to undo, right? So what we're doing when the addiction's developing is we're altering the brain's response to substance-related activities and experiences. And because these changes are occurring at the biological or biochemical level, it's a disease, right? And so the person really doesn't have control over the changes in their brain, and so they should be treated as such. And so most of the medical field believes that we should be treating people who have addictions by placing them in clinics and giving them resources to help them overcome their addiction, rather than throwing them in jail or incarcerating them simply because they possessed and utilized an illegal substance. We wouldn't necessarily, throw somebody with heart disease in jail because they chose to eat poorly and not take good care of themselves and gave themselves a disease, right? And so we shouldn't be doing the same thing for addiction. And so here's your summary for this lecture. I'm not going to go through it because I've just gone over the lecture. And here are your exit ticket questions. What I want you to do for number 2 is, in your own words, describe tolerance and withdrawal, and then describe how withdrawal may contribute to addictive behavior, the desire that the person wants to go back to using the substance despite negative consequences. All right, that's it. Good luck answering them.